With the beauty of re-releases and downloadable additional episodes, there are 3 1/4 and 1/4 again numbered Xenoblade entries on the Nintendo Switch itself, and additionally a long forgotten spin-off that came out on the Wii U. This makes the Xeno series developers Monolith Soft, who also stepped in to provide additional support on major blockbuster Nintendo games like Breath of the Wild, one of the most important games makers in Nintendo's arsenal. And this is one of the most important modern blockbuster video game series that they own. But no discussion of Xenoblade Chronicles would make sense if it didn't point out how this seminal 2010 Japanese role-playing game had every card in the deck stacked against it for international success. It never should have been the game it became. That disconnect, for very strange reasons, really does make this one of the most important video games of all time. It's a game that only makes sense if you try and remember what the video games world was like in 2010. I have loved role-playing games since the PlayStation 2 introduced me to them with Final Fantasy X. Although my love for that series made me go backwards to the PlayStation 1, the Super Nintendo, and there were handheld re-releases of The Elder Statesman in the series. By the end of the PlayStation 2 console lifespan, I'd pretty much caught up on all of the first 10 games in the series, and I was waiting with bated breath for the heavily delayed Final Fantasy XII, filling in the time by learning more about other role-playing games with a slightly more Western variety. It's key to define this difference now between JRPGs and what an English speaker might call a standard role-playing game. That J is doing a lot of heavy lifting, although exactly what it means itself is hotly contested. To summarise, Japanese role-playing games have traditionally favoured providing pre-assigned roles and tightly scripted storylines, as though the game is a book, slowly reeling out new pages of the story as you progress through the game. American role-playing games, however, often prioritise freedom. It's one of the few elements of USA society that truly lives up to its pedigree, and as a result, the games are more about embodying your character. Up to the mid-2000s, it's fair to say that, in general, Western RPGs had dominated the PC computer market with standout titles like Baldur's Gate and Fallout, whilst JRPGs had flourished on consoles. However, the infinitely delayed Final Fantasy XII felt like the end of an era. Part of this was because I've missed an entry. Final Fantasy XI was the series' first online RPG, a MMO, and the first paid one that really had the pedigree to stand on its own against the mighty World of Warcraft. It's hard to define why Final Fantasy XII was so divisive, but the new reality of a series stepping back to a single player experience after that, the dark fate of releasing at the end of a console's lifespan. For me, Final Fantasy XII was a perfect game. I've completed it at least 3 times, and many critics heralded it as the best JRPG yet, but for many other people, it fell slightly flat. The next games consoles, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, were on the horizon, boasting far more interesting and vibrant experiences. It's fair to say that JRPGs hit a bit of a slump as their Western counterparts took advantage of the new horsepower to run headfirst into the powered-up consoles, and they came to dominate the market. They offered wider, more vibrant worlds. To counter this, Final Fantasy appeared to retreat into itself. Final Fantasy XIII has its fans. It's by no means a detestable entry, but Square Enix's priorities at this point were to show off the graphics and the convoluted lore, the storytelling behind it. As a result, player freedom was reined back completely. That narrow tightrope the series had always walked between, hand-holding and open adventure, was yanked so far in one direction that many of the series fans just walked away. And through all of this, Nintendo was riding high on the massive popularity of the Wii, a console that sold to everyone. Their titles were becoming more and more tailored to Joe Public, and their traditional audience who had stuck with them through the SNES, N64 and the GameCube years grew disenfranchised at the big N, had no interest in hardcore gamers anymore. So, what is it that I'm saying? In 2009, it was a bad time to be a console JRPG fan or a Nintendo fan. Yes, there were some bright sparks in there, some amazing games released on the Wii, and there were brilliant JRPGs in this period, but on the whole, both scenes felt as though they were falling into a bit of a dark pit. And Xenoblade Chronicles single-handedly changes that. How did it do that? It happened because Nintendo refused to release it in America. In summer 2009, Nintendo listed in their upcoming releases a game called Monado, the beginning of the world, and even went as far as to put an entry on Amazon indicating that it would be an extensively customizable role-playing game. There wasn't a lot of information about this title, although in January 2010 it was announced that the Japanese title of the game was actually going to be Xenoblade. Around this time, there are two other games worth being aware of. One of them is called The Last Story, which is still to this date the final console JRPG from the creator of the Final Fantasy series, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and the other is a loose Zelda-style gothic adventure called Pandora's Tower by the much smaller studio Ganbarion. These are 3 Japanese role-playing games that were all released in the twilight years of the supposedly mainstream gamer-unfriendly console of the Nintendo Wii. It felt too good to be true to see these 3 games on the horizon, and it was, for Western fans, because through summer 2010, gamers were waiting for the news of these localizations. The translation of the long storylines of role-playing games from Japanese to English is a difficult and expensive process. However, they were absent from all major gaming announcements. Eventually, word came out that Xenoblade Chronicles was getting a Western translation from Nintendo of Europe. This was a little strange, as the European Nintendo outlet is a much smaller operation than the American equivalent. But there was some smart reasoning here. If it was going to be released in Europe, the game needed to have multiple languages: French, German, Spanish, more. Given the pool of expertise in Nintendo of Europe, the translation abilities of the teams there, they costed in the English translation as well and proceeded to advertise the game for 2011 release in the United Kingdom and mainland Europe, but not America. There are longer, better and more specific videos about the history of what became known as Operation Rainfall, but it really was a watershed moment in the latter years of the Wii's lifespan. Suddenly, Xenoblade Chronicles was being hallmarked as a totem of rank injustice, of blatant capitalist mindset that had overtaken Nintendo, that embodied everything wrong about the company. Their refusal to release Xenoblade Chronicles in the USA, even though they had a freely and readily translated official version courtesy of their British colleagues, was proof that the higher-ups Nintendo had abandoned their traditional fanbase. And I watched all of this with morbid curiosity. What was this hallowed game? The biggest and most significant of the 3, picked up by Operation Rainfall as an example of Nintendo's hubris. There was something strange about those early trailers for the game. All they showed off was characters running around the world. It was set in a massive world. That was clear to see, it was very interesting, but there wasn't much explanation of the story or the gameplay beyond lots and lots of running. But that world, that image of an enormous godlike titan bearing down on you, thrusting the largest sword your mind could possibly comprehend towards the ground itself, that was a striking image. And so I purchased the special edition of Xenoblade Chronicles featuring the red Wii Pro controller. I found myself absolutely engrossed by the wonderful, imaginative world of a JRPG game. Firstly, I would say that in some respects it felt very familiar. The Wii was only moderately more powerful than the previous generation of consoles, and the design of Xenoblade Chronicles and the way it plays bears many similarities to Final Fantasy XII. It's a better looking game, slightly, but the graphics were clearly not Monolith Soft's priority. They let the aesthetics remain fairly standard so that they could impress with scope rather than majesty. It was a rejection of the design ethos from what was feeling more and more like the morally bankrupt Square Enix franchise that had sold its soul for beauty. Who cared that this was far from the best looking game even on the Wii console? It had scope, it had heart. The game starts simple. It follows the design mechanics of a simple MMO game, where you walk around areas and target enemies, deploying a variety of attacks or skills on them that refresh with cooldown times. The game provides secondary AI-controlled characters to join you on your journey, and much of the mechanical complexity of this game comes from working out how different skills or status effects will combine in unique and exciting combinations. It's about bringing down the enemy's health bars faster than your own is depleting, but also the characters talk to you constantly. With every special attack, every victory, every defeat, they will call on you or comment on your deficiencies. And it was a surprising revelation to hear those crisp British accents throughout the game. Ultimately, the reason Nintendo had rejected the European release was because it was just so European. All of the main characters, Shulk, Ryan, Dunban, Fiora, Melia, they have strong English accents that are instantly recognisable. This just wouldn't fly in America. Rather than budget re-recording the entire game from scratch, Nintendo of America were just turning their nose up at this. It's not all good. In fact, some of it is downright awful. Pictures declaring it's Rhine time became one of the first video game memes that I was ever aware of. However, on the whole, the voice cast stand up, particularly the main characters. Adam Howden was perfectly cast as Shulk, the heroic wielder of the Monado, and the player's main point of view of the story, able to bring every ounce of emotion from the game. Some of the cast have even gone on to do great things. Just a year after the game's release, Jenna Coleman would be announced as the next companion of Matt Smith's Doctor Who, and it's a testament to the actress that the imperious Melia feels 1,000 miles removed from the cool and calculating Clara. I seriously didn't realise this was the same woman until years after the fact. Xenoblade Chronicles is a fairly simple game all told. You assemble a core team of characters. Sometimes you have control over the composition of your team, and sometimes for plot reasons you don't. You travel through a series of hub areas with big open plains between them full of monsters that you fight to grind up and level up and buy new gear so you can face even larger and more intimidating foes. You can buy items from shops, take side quests from NPCs, and then, when ready, move on to the next hub area to move the storyline forwards. Find a new set of enemies to defeat and repeat. It excels in two areas, however. One of them is the setting. The scale of all of this is immense. The towns are full of quest givers who have their own routines throughout the day. The characters have complex backstories, and as you talk to them you build up a map of the complex interactions between the characters. This affinity chart is the soul of the game, as your progress is restricted not so much by your level. If you know how your systems and battle mechanics work, it's perfectly possible to take on enemies many levels higher than you, but by your affinity. Side quests are often locked behind affinity requirements with the town, i.e. how well you know the place, how much of a reputation you've built up, how much the characters of that town trust you. And skills, the special perks that will help you in battle, are similarly locked by how well your player team knows each other. Characters who have known each other for years and have each other's backs in all situations, such as Shulk and Ryan, bring out the best in each other, and they play better because of it. Pair Ryan up with a new, unknown companion, however, such as the surprisingly terrifying bundle of fur who is foisted onto you halfway through the game to be your ally in battle, whether you like it or not, and these perks dissipate. It takes time to build up these relationships, for the game characters to get to know each other, to build new potential in their teamwork, and to accomplish feats that neither could complete alone. It's a beautiful system, embedded into every aspect of the game, from the core player progression through to the side quests, through to the storyline itself. You start as a small group of outcasts on a mission of revenge, but end as an elite fighting group with allies harvested from each of the places you visited along the way. The other standout is the world. Game designer Tetsuya Takahashi prioritised building the world first and the storyline second, in stark contrast to all of his previous RPGs, which had been extremely narrative focused. You see, Monolith Soft had had a bit of a pedigree going into this game. Tetsuya had been a graphic designer for Square in the early 1990s, and he'd worked on a Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, and even the JRPG sweetheart game Chrono Trigger. In 1998, he had been promoted to director for the game Xenogears, an offshoot title that had at one point been considered to be Final Fantasy VII, but it was switched out in favour of an alternative storyline featuring someone called Cloud Strife. Nevertheless, he built a team to produce a game that he put his heart and soul into, acting as director, scenario writer, artist, and even part-time musician for. The team struggled and they crunched to produce the game, and when the dust was complete, Xenogears had so many ideas still on the cutting room floor, they were desperate to make a sequel. Unfortunately, Square wanted to focus on their big brand IPs, and they didn't greenlight any further games in the series. In response, Tetsuya co-founded a whole new company and he envisioned 6 new games. Not to pick up where he left off, but to start again from scratch. This was the Xeno Saga, a series of games released on the PlayStation 2 that spanned 2002 to 2006, but died just 3 games into the saga. Too ambitious for their own good, Monolith Soft were part purchased by Nintendo and consigned to a largely handheld or spin-off titles, or to act as a support studio on big releases such as Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Zelda Skyward Sword. When Monado Beginning of the World was listed in 2009, that's because it really was called that. Monolith Soft weren't trying to have a third bite of the cherry. Xenogears, Xeno Saga, Xenoblade. They honestly were trying something new. However, when they pitched to Nintendo of Japan, the publisher recognised the overlapping concepts, the story beats and the themes that Tetsuya just kept coming back to, and they suggested the name change. Monado became Xenoblade, and then Xenoblade Chronicles, and the die was set. The storyline Tetsuya came up with depicted 2 vast titans, the Bionis and the Mechonis, locked in an endless struggle until they decayed and atrophied. Over millennia, life sprang up on the bodies of these giants, but soon a war broke out between the biological life forms in the Bionis and the mechanical monstrosities on the Mechonis. Only one form of life could survive. Conflict was inevitable. This, if you play the game, is where we begin. After a brief monologue setting the scene, we're treated to an all-out war as Dunban, aided by 2 companions, holds the front line against the advancing Mechon army. Outgunned but resilient, Dunban prepares to lay his life on the line in defence of his people. Whilst one turns cowardly and flees, he and Dixon remain to face whatever may come. Cut to a year later, to an unassuming young man named Shulk. A bookish, quiet character who thinks carefully before he talks but puts his heart into everything he says. Despite first appearances, this isn't Dunban's game, it's Shulk's, and you are fetched by Ryan to come back to the colony and to complete your chores. The first 2 or 3 hours of Xenoblade Chronicles are quite simple, sending you on some simple fetch quests and light battles around the colony to adapt to the control scheme and the battle mechanics. Here, you discover that Dunban is not in fact dead, but he won the battle and ended the war, although he's no longer able to wield the sword he used so deftly on the battlefield. He's being nurtured back to health by his doting sister, Fiora, who happens to be Shulk's childhood sweetheart. Ryan is training as a warrior in the defence forces, the local army, sitting ready for any signs of Mechon aggression, and his best friend Shulk is a researcher studying the ancient and mysterious weapon that gave them the victory last time, and may be needed to be used again if the Mechon should ever return. This is the one storytelling trope that Xenoblade falls into that is a little disappointing initially, at first. Shulk is not just the player avatar, but a clear, chosen one. He's one of very few people who can handle the Monado without suffering for it. The weapon in one way is very much a cursed blade, and only a very select few people can hold it without recoiling in agony. Dunban carried it into battle and he lost the use of his arm for it. But Shulk can swing the sword with no ill effect at all. Furthermore, the sword has some special properties. It can cut through any metal, but it will not harm flesh at all. Shulk is destined to wield the Monado. And though there are plot reasons that will justify this later on, it's the one mundane fantasy aspect of the game that in so many other respects is very high concept. But whether you spend hours exploring every nook or cranny of the colony, or you rush straight through these opening tasks to advance the story, eventually Shulk, Rain and Fiora are sent on a quest outside of the colony, and when they return, it's to see a warship descending on them from above, with a horde of black shadows raining down. It's at this moment that reveals what Colony 9 really was. It was a hidden tutorial. And with a series of gut-punching cutscenes and unwinnable boss battles, the game begins to tell its story proper. The colony is attacked and Shulk realises he's the only one who can wield the Monado and fight back. He races into battle, Ryan and Fiora at his side. He retrieves the fabled weapon, turns to fight the menacing, silent, faced Mechon that seemed to be leading the assault, and he's soundly thumped. Not only do the face Mechon beat him, Ryan and even Dunban back, it slaughters Fiora. She climbs aboard an armoured tank to take on the Mechon, It fires both barrels straight into its face, and then she screams as its metal claws flick out towards her and yank her from her harness. Seconds later, all Shulk can see through the smoke is the blood dripping from its devastatingly long claws. And then, as quickly as it began, the invasion is over. The Mechon retreat. The colony is devastated and Shulk is left screaming bloody vengeance against Fiora's murderers. That is the story of Xenoblade Chronicles. That is the quest that takes you on a world-spanning journey across one titan on onto the next. This is a tale about revenge. The other characters you pick up all have their reason to hate the Mechonis. Rein, Dunban and Shulk's motivations concerning Fiora are well established at the start. Sharla's colony was already attacked before the invaders ever reached Colony 9, and almost everyone she knew, including her fiancé, are missing, presumed dead. Melia is a highborn princess from one of the civilizations on the top of the Bionis, whose people are attacked and who sees her own father cut down in front of her. Ricky, the Nopon, cute member of the cast, is less clear, but he values all life and friends on the Bionis, and he recognises the existential threat of the Mechons. Honestly, to people not familiar with JRPGs, the appearance of a talking hamster might seem strange at first glance, but this is one of several periodic reminders about the genre that this game fits into. Each hub area has its own plot, its own dilemma to solve, a new chapter in Shulk's adventure as he sets out to bring Fiora's killers to justice. But what began as silent murdering killers slowly emerged to be a complex, internally layered society. It emerges that the face Mechon can talk, that there are several of them, and that they have distinct differences of opinion about what to do about the people of the Bionis. And here is where, to go any further, I would have to spoil the game. Because the storyline of Xenoblade Chronicles, although it starts as a fairly simple adventure quest, taking you from new biome to new biome in a linear fashion, ultimately resolves around 3 enormous cliffhangers. Just to indicate that they exist is to potentially spoil the game. And I don't normally relay entire game stories on this channel, and truthfully, I don't want to here. I think it deserves its own video. There are so many more characters important to the plot, so many moments I can't touch on without giving too much away, but I'm constantly awed at how by designing a game around a moment of surrealist architecture, Tetsuya Takahashi was able to design one of the most comprehensive JRPGs of the decade, with not one, but 3 earth-shattering plot twists, and it garnered a lot of attention. In Japan and Europe, the game was hailed as a masterpiece, eventually so much so that Nintendo licensed the game to Atlus to release in the United States. Monolith Soft got the green light to work on a sequel on the Wii U, then another proper sequel for the launch year of the Nintendo Switch. Both times, Nintendo of America were ready, waiting to promote the game as Nintendo's own brand role-playing game masterpiece. They even kept the international voice cast, introducing a mixture of British, Australian and American voice actors to keep the series distinctive. And whilst the sequels have been massive successes in their own right, I will always have fond memories of this original game. It's tightly plotted, one of the main criticisms of the sequels, and the tutorials get longer and more complex. But Colony 9 is the perfect size to set both the feel, controls and tone of the game. Xenoblade Chronicles is one of the most important JRPGs ever made, not just because of the boundaries it pushed on an aging console, one that had been largely written off by the mainstream gaming media, because of the way it introduced complex and competing systems to demonstrate how RPG worlds could grow with the player, and not just because it was a phenomenal story. It's important because it showed how one of the biggest corporations in video games that they can, every now and then, get it completely wrong. But in this case, thank God they did, because without Nintendo of Europe, we would never have gotten this cast, this quirky international legacy for Monolith Soft's future sequels.